Palace staff had heard many things in their years of service, but never this. The muffled, heart-wrenching sobs of Prince William. A man trained from childhood to hide emotion shattered the silence of Clarence House. What broke the future king so completely? The answer lay behind a locked door, where Catherine had just revealed something that would forever change the course of their family and the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The air was different that morning. Not tense, but too quiet. Staff moved softly through the halls, glancing at one another with concern. Then, it happened. A sound they couldn't place at first. Like grief made physical. It came from the family sitting room. Muffled at first, but rising raw, uncontrollable. When realization set in, the silence became suffocating. Prince William was crying. It wasn't the cry of a man in pain. It was something deeper. A primal, helpless sob that seemed to collapse every wall of composure he had spent decades building. Some who heard it froze in place. Others fled. None dared interrupt, not even his most trusted aides. Behind the locked door, only his immediate family had gathered. Catherine had made that clear: no outsiders. No staff. No security. Just them. And when the door finally opened, it wasn't the prince who stepped out. It was the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis, eyes wide, expressions blank. Their faces were pale, their steps hesitant. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them made eye contact. They walked past stunned staff, as if they were moving through fog. Something terrible had just been said. Whispers ignited instantly. What could shake the royal family like this? What secret had Catherine held in so tightly that, when released, left her children dazed and her husband destroyed? The sitting room remained locked for another hour. But the damage was already done. Emotion poured through the cracks. One source said it felt like time itself had stopped inside the palace. Another described a heaviness that pressed down on every corridor. No announcements were made, no statements issued, but it didn't matter. Everyone inside Clarence House knew something irreversible had occurred. Some suspected health news, others whispered of scandal. A few feared political consequences, but nothing seemed to fit. This wasn't the usual chaos that surrounded royal life. It was more intimate, more terrifying, a personal truth that ripped through layers of tradition and shattered the illusion of control. And still, William did not reappear. The man who had once walked behind his mother's coffin with the composure of a soldier, who had held himself together during national mourning and global scrutiny, was now breaking. He hadn't broken for the crown, for duty, or for the cameras. He had broken for something behind that door. Catherine, too, was unseen for the rest of the day. And that, more than anything, confirmed the scale of what had unfolded. She had spoken a truth that shook the very foundations of her family. The consequences of that confession were only beginning to take form. But the signs had been there for months, hidden in Catherine's fading smiles and whispered conversations no one dared to interrupt. Long before William's tears, something in Catherine had changed. She wore her grace like armor, but underneath was a woman unraveling. And while the public praised her elegance, her family watched her disappear into herself, haunted, restless, and secretive. It began subtly. At first, it was a missed engagement here, a rescheduled appearance there. Catherine, known for her reliability, began offering vague excuses: exhaustion, scheduling conflicts, the flu. Yet behind the excuses, there was something far heavier. Staff started noticing her presence didn't quite fill the room as it once did. She seemed distracted, speaking less, smiling less. When asked if everything was all right, she would simply nod, but it wasn't. She began driving the children to school herself, something usually arranged with tight security and scheduled far in advance. 3 times in 1 week, she arrived unannounced, waving off protection officers and insisting on doing it alone. Those closest to her knew this wasn't routine, it was deliberate. She wanted to be alone with the children, but not for comfort. It was as if she was searching for something in their faces, their words. Something she desperately needed to hear. Charlotte was the first to see her mother truly break. It was late afternoon in the palace gardens. Catherine thought she was alone, shielded by rose bushes, lost in thought. But Charlotte saw her. Silent tears streamed down her face, her shoulders trembling, hands clenched tightly in her lap. The little girl stood frozen for a moment before quietly turning away, not daring to interrupt the grief she did not understand. William sensed it too, though she worked hard to shield him from it. One evening, he climbed the stairs after a quiet dinner and found the bathroom door slightly ajar. Inside, Catherine sat on the floor, her back against the wall, phone clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears. She looked up, startled, quickly wiping her cheeks. "Just stress," she whispered. But he didn't believe her, not then, and not for a moment after. Even George noticed. In a hushed conversation with his father, he admitted that Mum's been acting strange. She'd asked him odd questions on their rides home. Questions like, "Do you ever wish our family were normal?" And "What do you think makes someone who they are?" At first, George thought she was just being thoughtful, maybe even playful, but the way she looked at him like she was clinging to his answers unsettled him. Then came the strangest of all, Catherine's sudden interest in the royal archives. Without warning or explanation, she began requesting hours of access. Not for official duties or research. When asked, she gave a brief answer about preparing for a future project on heritage. But those who processed her requests couldn't help but feel the explanation was a mask for something much more personal. She spent entire afternoons combing through documents no one had touched in decades. Searching. Again. William didn't press her. Not yet. But the weight of unanswered questions was building. The woman he loved, the mother of his children, was slipping away behind walls he couldn't see through. And then came the moment William couldn't ignore any longer, the night he overheard a phone call that ripped the floor out from under him. She thought she was alone, but William heard everything. His wife's voice quivered as she admitted she couldn't hide it anymore. "How do I tell them their lives are about to change?" she whispered. That sentence would haunt William and ignite a desperate search for truth. It was an ordinary afternoon on the surface. William's royal engagement had ended ahead of schedule. No press, no crowds, just an unexpectedly quiet return home. He stepped through the palace doors, unannounced, hoping to catch a rare, peaceful moment. But what he heard instead would destroy that illusion in seconds. Her voice carried through the hallway, not loud, but desperate. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this from them," she said. "Every day that passes makes it harder. They deserve to know." William froze in place. He recognized the tremor in her voice, the guilt laced through every word. His heart began to race, a thunderous beat in his chest that drowned out reason. She was talking to someone who knew everything before he did. He didn't move. Couldn't. His instincts told him to walk into the room, confront her, demand answers. But something deeper, something more primal stopped him. Catherine was hiding something, and it wasn't just from the children. It was from him. For the first time in their marriage, he felt truly locked out of her world. As he stood there, every worst-case scenario came rushing forward. Was she sick? Was there a threat to the family? Had something happened with one of the children? The not knowing was worse than anything he could imagine, and Catherine's next words didn't help. "I'm terrified of what this will do to them," she whispered. "How do I even begin to explain?" Her voice cracked, a sob slipping through. "How do I tell them their entire lives are about to change?" The hallway felt colder now. William stepped back, almost in retreat, trying to process what he had just heard. Her words weren't about the monarchy. They weren't about royal obligations or scandals. This was personal, deeply, irreversibly personal. And it was coming for their family like a storm, with no warning. He didn't confront her that night, not immediately. Instead, he watched in silence as Catherine moved through the rest of the day. She smiled at dinner, asked the children about school, helped Louis with his shoes, but William could see through it all. Her eyes kept flicking toward the clock. Her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one noticed. It was all an act, an attempt to buy time before everything fell apart. That night, sleep escaped him. William lay awake beside her, his mind replaying every word, every glance, every change in her behavior over the past few months. He felt like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, and the picture was far more terrifying than he was prepared to see. He wanted to shake her, to beg for the truth. But he didn't. Not yet, because deep down, he knew, whatever this was, it would alter everything they knew about their lives, their children, their future. And when the truth finally came, it didn't just confirm his worst fears, it introduced horrors he'd never considered possible. And what she revealed was unthinkable, an announcement that shattered the meaning of parenthood. This wasn't about a scandal. This wasn't even about the monarchy. Catherine revealed that their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been unknowingly subjected to experimental genetic modification before birth, a violation so intimate it redefined betrayal. The room was still when Catherine began to speak, as if even the walls knew they were about to bear witness to something devastating. Her voice trembled, but she pushed through. Years ago, she and William had undergone assisted fertility treatments, a journey they kept private, buried beneath smiles and public engagements. But what they thought was a hopeful step toward parenthood had become something else entirely, something monstrous. With each word, Catherine peeled back layers of secrecy. The clinic they had trusted, the specialists who had promised them healthy pregnancies, had manipulated more than just medicine. They had used their unborn children as test subjects in a hidden program, altering their genetic makeup without consent. The procedures were unauthorized, the goals chilling. Enhanced intelligence, superior immunity, extended longevity. It wasn't healing. It was engineering. William sat in stunned silence, struggling to absorb what he was hearing. These weren't complications of science. They were violations of humanity. And they had happened to his children, to the three souls he believed he knew better than anyone in the world. Catherine had learned the truth months earlier, tipped off by a journalist chasing a lead on illegal fertility research. At first, she didn't believe it, but the documents were undeniable. Medical records, forged consent forms, internal memos from the clinic detailing their covert experiments. Every page stabbed at her like a blade, and instead of telling William, she chose to carry it alone, out of fear, out of guilt, out of not knowing how to shatter the illusion of safety they had built around their family. George's reaction was immediate and brutal. He stood, his voice shaking with rage and confusion. "What are you saying? That I'm not real?" he demanded. Catherine reached for him, but he recoiled. To him, the revelation wasn't scientific, it was existential. He felt artificial, altered, violated. Charlotte began to cry quietly, the weight of the moment too much for her young heart to hold. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood pain. Louis simply looked around. Unsure why everyone he loved suddenly looked so broken, Catherine tried to explain. Tried to reassure them that nothing about their essence had changed. But the words sounded hollow, even to her. She told them she and William had never agreed to anything like this. That they were as much victims as the children. But how do you tell a child that someone rewrote their blueprint without asking? That they were made, not just born? William couldn't speak. His breath came in short bursts. His entire world, the foundation of his fatherhood, had been rewritten in a matter of minutes. The children he held, guided, protected, were they even who he thought they were? Could he trust what was real anymore? But the full scope of this betrayal had only just begun, and William was about to demand every detail. The palace walls trembled, not from war or scandal, but from the sound of a father breaking. William, once the image of royal restraint, was now a man consumed by helpless fury. His children had been turned into lab experiments, and no one had warned him. The hours after Catherine's confession passed, in a blur of silence and shock. William avoided everyone. He walked the same corridors he had known his entire life. But now, nothing looked the same. He didn't recognize the world he was living in, nor the family he had sworn to protect. When he finally returned to their bedroom that evening, his face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides, his voice trembling. And then, the storm erupted. He demanded to know why she hadn't come to him sooner, why she had carried the burden alone. why she had allowed him to remain blind to something that redefined their very existence. Catherine, already hollowed out by guilt, tried to answer, but her words only deepened the wound. She hadn't trusted herself to handle the fallout, let alone burden him with it. She needed time. She needed space to understand. But he didn't want excuses. He wanted truth. And more than anything, he wanted a chance to have been there for her, and she had taken that away. "You didn't protect me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shut me out and left me powerless. You let me think everything was fine while carrying this hell alone. That wasn't strength, Catherine. That was betrayal." She sobbed, falling to her knees, begging for forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't come easily when the people you love most have been irrevocably altered, and you never even had the chance to stop it. Then came the moment that crushed them both. Catherine admitted the truth no parent ever wants to hear. The changes, those hidden genetic modifications, could not be undone. The procedures had permanently altered George, Charlotte, and Louis. Whatever was done to them in that clinic was now part of them, fused into their very being. There was no reversing it, no way to erase the violation that had occurred. And as those words settled between them like lead, the door creaked open, and George stepped inside. His face was red, his fists clenched. He had heard enough. "So, I'm just some lab rat, then?" he snapped. "Some science project you ordered up like a designer handbag?" Catherine's eyes widened in horror. But George wasn't finished. "You let someone mess with who I am before I was even born. What does that make me now? Manufactured? Fake? Just a product of someone else's experiment?" William stood still, his heart breaking in slow motion. He tried to reach for his son, but George recoiled. The trust that once bound them as father and son now dangled by a thread. And in that moment, William realized this wasn't just about science or ethics. It was about identity, betrayal, and a child trying to make sense of a world that had rewritten his very origin. But the royal crisis was no longer just personal. It was about to go public. The crown has survived wars, abdications, and scandals. But this? A question of legitimacy, ethics, and the future bloodline. As legal teams assembled and the press circled like vultures, the monarchy faced its most existential threat yet. What began as a private heartbreak inside Clarence House was now rapidly spiraling into a national crisis. The walls that once contained the royal family's most painful secret could no longer hold. Advisors understood immediately this wasn't just a domestic matter. It was a constitutional dilemma. And the moment news reached senior aides, a crisis command center was activated behind palace gates. King Charles was briefed first. What followed was not fury, but something worse. Silence. Then, slowly, the questions began. Who else knew? How long had this been going on? And the one that left every advisor breathless, can genetically modified children legally inherit the crown? No precedent existed. No guidance from history books. No protocol tucked away in the royal playbook. The monarchy had faced scandals involving lovers, liars, even treason. But never science. Never the quiet tampering of DNA behind a clinic's closed doors. This wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about survival. Charles, long known for keeping emotion under control, reportedly lost that control in private. Legal counsel, public relations teams, even constitutional scholars were summoned. No one had a clear answer. Could Parliament intervene? Could the Crown preemptively make rulings about succession? Could the public accept an heir whose very genetic code had been altered without consent? While chaos erupted behind the scenes, Queen Camilla surprised everyone. Instead of distancing herself or leaning into royal detachment, she leaned into family. She began spending more time with the children, especially Charlotte and Louis. She brought calm where silence once hung. With William barely holding himself together and Catherine consumed by shame, Camilla stepped in as the unexpected anchor. It wasn't grandeur or power she offered, it was comfort. But comfort was not a currency the monarchy could trade in publicly. Outside the palace, the world demanded answers. Leaks from within royal staffers, triggered headlines that were both invasive and incendiary. News outlets across the globe picked up the story. Ethical debates exploded on television. Talk shows questioned the monarchy's future. Social media became a battlefield. Was this a violation of human rights or an unintentional miracle of science? Were the royal children victims or symbols of something terrifyingly modern? Legal advisors warned that silence would only fan the flames. A statement had to be made. But how do you speak to a nation and a world about something so intimate, so complex, so deeply disturbing? The family crafted a response with the help of medical and legal experts. It confirmed the revelations without revealing too much. It emphasized that William and Catherine had been deceived, not complicit. But most of all, it begged for privacy, for time, for understanding. But that understanding was hard to come by. Parliament murmured about constitutional review. Traditionalists whispered about bloodline purity. Progressives demanded transparency and reform. And floating above it all was one unshakable truth: everything had changed. The rules were no longer written in stone. They were being rewritten in real time, under unbearable scrutiny. And through it all, the children struggled to find meaning in a world that no longer felt like theirs. Stripped of innocence, the royal children were now symbols of controversy. But from the ruins of betrayal, they began to rise, each forging a new identity beyond their DNA, beyond the crown, beyond the whispers. For days, George barely spoke. When he did, his words carried a heaviness far beyond his years. He no longer asked questions. He questioned everything. Was his academic success the result of hard work, or the outcome of altered genes? Were his instincts, his talents, his very sense of self, truly his own? He began to withdraw, avoiding even his siblings. The boy who had once been so confident, so full of purpose, now stared at his reflection with doubt in his eyes, wondering if the mirror told a lie. But William and Catherine refused to let him spiral alone. They brought in a therapist who specialized in identity trauma. At first, George resisted. He didn't want to be fixed. He wanted answers. Yet over time, therapy helped him see what he couldn't at first. Enhancement may have altered potential, but it didn't dictate outcome. He still made choices. He still studied, struggled, failed, and succeeded like anyone else. His humanity had not been stolen, it had been tested. And that realization was his turning point. Charlotte's healing took a different path. She didn't speak much about the revelations, but her sketchbook filled quickly. At first, the drawings were dark and chaotic images of broken crowns and faceless figures. But then, they changed. The faceless figures gained eyes, expressions, then wings. The crowns were reimagined, not broken, but reshaped. She began to find solace in creation, in reassembling the shattered pieces of her world into something new, something beautiful. Her art became her voice, her weapon, and her refuge. Louis, still young enough to live partly in innocence, processed things in bursts of emotion. He asked blunt questions at the dinner table. Why are people saying we're not real? Why did Mom cry so much, and then turned back to his toys? But even his simplicity carried weight. He reminded them all that joy wasn't incompatible with pain. That laughter could coexist with truth. His resilience gave the family moments of light. In the darkest hours, as a unit, the children challenged their parents constantly. They wanted to understand everything. How the clinic got away with it. Why no one noticed sooner. And whether anyone would ever face consequences. Catherine and William answered as best they could. Not with platitudes, but with honesty. Some answers were painful, others incomplete. But every answer was real. Gradually, the family found rhythm again. Not the rhythm they had before, but one built on truth and acceptance. They learned to coexist with the past, without letting it define their future. Scars remained, but they weren't ashamed of them anymore. They wore them like armor, not to protect themselves from the world, but to show the world they had survived. And in that survival, they found something extraordinary. Not just strength, but transformation. The children were no longer just heirs to a crown, they were warriors of identity. born from chaos, shaped by truth, and defined by choice. But Catherine and William weren't done. They were about to turn their personal nightmare into a public fight for justice. This wasn't just their story anymore, it was a movement. Catherine and William stepped into the spotlight, not as royals, but as parents demanding accountability. And the world was finally ready to listen. What began as private devastation transformed into something far larger than they could have imagined. The moment the truth went public, families across the globe began reaching out. Parents who had visited the same clinic, couples who had trusted the same doctors. Some had no idea they had been victims until now. Catherine knew she couldn't allow their silence to continue. She created a confidential support network, one that offered guidance, community, and resources for families discovering they too had been deceived by science, disguised as hope. But this wasn't just emotional work, it was legal warfare. William, usually cautious and reserved in political matters, became uncharacteristically vocal. He met with lawmakers behind closed doors, urging them to reconsider the boundaries of fertility regulation and genetic oversight. He wasn't just speaking as a prince, he was speaking as a father, whose children had been treated like prototypes. He called for reforms that would expose and eliminate the loopholes that allowed rogue clinics to operate in the shadows. The public took notice. The narrative shifted. No longer were they the center of a scandal, they were champions of truth. Vulnerable yet unwavering, they showed the world that royalty didn't protect them from pain, but it could be used to protect others. Their courage broke the silence for dozens of other families, and in doing so, began rewriting the ethical framework surrounding fertility medicine. Meanwhile, the legal case against the clinic escalated. The name at the center of it all, Dr. Marcus Holloway, became synonymous with arrogance and disregard. In media interviews, he called himself a visionary, claiming history would vindicate his work. But when brought before the court, stripped of charm and protected status, his bravado faltered. Evidence piled high. Memos, emails, medical records, each one a nail in the coffin of his empire. Then came the day Catherine walked into the courtroom and faced the man who had altered her children without permission. She wasn't there in jewels or gowns. She wasn't there for headlines. She was there for justice. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of deception, of shattered trust, of the psychological war waged on her family without a single warning. Every word was a blow, not for revenge, but for accountability. She didn't ask for sympathy. She demanded responsibility. What once felt like helplessness had now become action. What began in secrecy now stood in full light. Catherine and William used every platform they had: press conferences, policy discussions, private advocacy to expose the truth. Their pain was not a weakness. It was a weapon, and they wielded it to tear down the very system that had betrayed them. But in the quiet of their home, healing remained the hardest journey of all. They had been through hell together. And though the storm was not over, they had found something unshakable: each other. Behind palace walls, amidst the echoes of scandal, the laughter of their children still rang out. That, more than anything, was the sound of survival. There was no single moment when healing arrived. It came slowly, in fragments. In long therapy sessions where words broke open wounds and silence stitched them closed. In apologies whispered between siblings. In the way Catherine and William held hands longer than before, not out of habit, but necessity. They had built a new rhythm, one not governed by royal routine, but by emotional repair. What had once been defined by protocol was now held together by presence. George, no longer the boy questioning his existence, began to confront the deeper implications of what had been done to him. He read everything he could about genetics, ethics, and human rights. Not out of anger, but clarity. He told his parents he wanted to study bioethics, not because he had the answers, but because he now understood the cost of not asking the right questions. What had once shattered him was now shaping him into someone who could challenge the system that betrayed him. Charlotte, with quiet confidence, continued to paint, but her art had evolved, no longer dark and abstract. Her canvases depicted people from all walks of life, different bodies, different faces, all equally worthy. Her pieces began showing up in public exhibitions, always under a pseudonym. Critics praised the rawness of emotion in her work. She didn't seek recognition. She simply wanted to remind the world that difference was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. And then there was Louis. He was the family's heartbeat, still blissfully untouched by the deeper complexities. His innocence was not ignorance, but strength. He reminded them how to laugh when everything felt heavy, how to dance when silence loomed, how to be present in a moment without analyzing it. His presence was the daily reminder that joy could live alongside truth, and it was that joy that kept the entire family grounded. William and Catherine had changed too. Their marriage, once anchored in love and duty, had grown into something far more resilient. They no longer avoided hard conversations. They didn't hide their fears, they faced them together. The betrayal, the secrecy, the grief, it had torn through them like fire. But what remained after the burn was something stronger, something forged. They had seen each other at their worst and had chosen, again and again, to stay. Outside the palace, the media had moved on. New scandals emerged, new faces took the spotlight. But inside, the family lived with the aftermath. They did not erase the past, they honored it. They spoke openly, they stayed close, and they chose healing every single day. The monarchy, for all its history, had never faced a test like this. But it endured not through silence or power, but through the raw courage of a family that refused to break. Because even in the darkest moments, the royal family proved that truth, though painful, could forge a legacy more powerful than any crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.